All right, all right. Da, 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 da. Real quick. Oh man. All right. Cool. Welcome. Sorry about last week. I've been traveling, had a great time in Belize. Thank you for asking me. Had a crazy time getting back into New York and getting back into the States. But we're back and we're going to continue on CSS. One quick addition. For Wednesdays, I'm doing work from home Wednesdays. Pretty much work from home Wednesdays will be an opportunity for folks who have the time to come join me on Zoom as I work from home. And you'll get to see some of the real life projects I take on. And now that we are crossing over into JavaScript land, stuff's going to make a lot more sense on what I'm doing. And yeah, I think it'll be a great opportunity for folks who have time on Wednesday. I want to see what they might be doing with this. All right. With that said, let's hit these two CSS lessons that I really want us to cover. We did the box model. Good. Pseudo elements we need to touch on. And I think display property. Background. Let's hit, actually, we might just hit these three. So display property isn't too complicated, 3-minute video.
Display properties are another very common property used within CSS styling. When it comes to HTML, we had talked about spans, we had talked about divs, and spans by default were displayed inline and divs by default were displayed block. And so we look at the website, we can see that as well, that we've got this inline display. Actually, I should get rid of some of this background here. And to comment out CSS, all you have to do is do this same type of thing here where we do a slash, an asterisk, and then an asterisk and slash to bring it back in. I'm just going to refresh that so it's a little bit more visible. And so with the display properties, we see that the blocks by default, or the divs by default, have these block type properties where they're taking up the entire width of allocated space, and the spans are always just inline. So even though we had a bunch of spans here, I think we can see them here because they're highlighted yellow, they're actually in line with the text. So what happens if we change span display to block? So they're going to act a little bit more like divs, and you're going to see that they're actually going to be taking up their own lines. And then vice versa, if we change this divs to inline. And now effectively what we've done is we've changed the way that divs and spans behave, and we've swapped them around. And that's what you can do with the display properties. Additionally, there's another one that's commonly used, especially if you're using JavaScript to interact with your CSS, and that's display none. And I'm just going to apply display none to that as well. And you can see when I do a display none, it actually disappears. The content, although it's still there within HTML code, it's not being displayed within the browser. So the browser is able to read and understand that. And in fact, it just doesn't display any of the content. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is kind of similar to when we talk about display or visibility hidden. So there's
Fun stuff. New Wi-Fi, same problems.
None and visibility is that even though still nothing is showing up here for the divs, that we don't see anything on the actual page, if you notice that the footer actually moved right to the bottom. And that's because visibility hidden still reserves that spacing. as opposed to display none, which actually just removes out that entire element from the HTML. So it removes out that spacing. So that's the difference. The main difference between visibility hidden and display none is that the visibility hidden still reserves the spacing, and display none just simply removes it out from the web page content. So I just changed that back to display none, and you'll see that that footer now is going to move up because that spacing is no longer reserved, and display none has just hidden away all of that content.
All right, so super short, super simple. Honestly, for display, the most we're going to be using is inline, inline block, flex, and also display none, as well as block. But yeah, they're going to be mostly reused. As we play around with CSS, we're going to see specifically which one we want to use. But it's really all about how these elements interact with each other and making sure that they don't treat each other on the same line. All right, let's go to not pseudo elements. I think this is 1 minute reading. Let's look at a web template.
So as we had looked at before, these pseudo elements really give the selectors a little bit more functionality. So here we've added in another pseudo element into divs, where we're selecting the first letter and we're just coloring it red. So we go out to the code, we see that in fact, indeed, all the first letters of any div are going to be colored red. So if you see here, there's a second div, this one, and maybe we're just going to remove out that coloring that we had there before. And just refresh that so it does highlight a little bit more. So we can see that in fact, the first letter is always going to be red in the divs. And again, this comes out to making it specific and being able to really isolate styling called for all the first letters to have color of red and maybe be bold. We can go back out and we can add that in and refresh the page, and we see that in fact the pseudo elements are applying those styles, that property, to each individual div, starting letter of the divs. So with the pseudo styling, you also do have options to do stuff like this, where you can pick up the child and you can do the odd ones, you can do the even ones, and the code simply just looks like this. So we're identifying that selector and picking up that additional nested element.
Actually, real quick, I think we should, let me open this up real quick, because I'm actually learning something I was unaware of. I did not know that first letter was a real pseudo element. Let's look at these lists of pseudo classes. So this list is all built-in pseudo elements. Okay, I didn't know this was a real one. As you can see, I never actually read the list. I'm gonna download this and drop it in the course document. Oh, I already downloaded this. Oh man, I didn't have time to look at it, but that's super interesting and very important.
Nested element, and from here we're doing nth child and we're doing odd. We can also do things like even, and just to show you how that turns out. And we can select out all of these different children that are available within that particular selector. In addition to being able to add hover to hyperlinks, you can also add it to any element. So I've just added it to all the different spans that are available within this element. And you can see here, once I hover over them, we do have this changing background color. So there's quite a lot you can do with pseudo elements. And we're going to give you a link to see a little bit more code and a little bit more pseudo elements, because there's quite a lot to go through. So we're going to be providing a document for that in the next lesson. So within this lesson, we're going to bring together all of the CSS styling as well as the HTML code that we've looked at within the previous lessons. So we're just going to show you what it's going to look like with the CSS styling and then without the CSS styling. So without CSS, our web page is rather plain and there's not a whole lot happening. So when we do add in that CSS link, that CSS page, and we go back out and we refresh our website template, we can see that now we've got some really nice effects, and we've got basically a web template that's ready to go. Just quickly added these additional HTML pages. And as we can see, as we go through them, we're actually able to see that once we do click on those links, they're going to turn orange because we've already visited them. So going back to the index page, we see that our page actually resizes. So it is responsive, and we see that some of the content will move down and shift under depending on the width of the website or the browser. And the way that we're doing that is we've added in what's called media queries. And with media queries, so we're able to set media screen. If the maximum width is 960, then it's going to apply these. So anything under 960, it's going to apply this. And anything under 600, it's going to apply all this styling, all these styling properties. And then just by default, if it's not matching any one of these criteria, it's just applying that regular styling. So this gets applied to every single web page and every single piece of content that we have. So that's our default template for creating web pages. And now we're going to dive deeper into the code. So the way that we've structured it is a standard HTML page where we've got our document type, our HTML, our head content, we're linking to our CSS, we've got our title here, and then some metadata in order to have that resizing, that viewport, and then determining what type of content it is that we're outputting. So we've also divided up our page. We've created one div, and we just called it wrapper. So this is going to encompass that entire body area. So in case we want to do something, I'd add additional divs. It's going to make it easy to do that without really affecting our website. So if we want to have some pop-up divs that are showing, we're going to keep them outside of our wrapper, but we still want them within our body. And that's the reasoning for adding that additional div, because we could very well just set that body properties if we want to be the same as the wrapper, and really it's going to be the same thing. But for us, we're trying to keep them separate. Because just forward thinking with what we might want to do with this website, keeping it separate is more along the lines of what we're looking to do. So going back into the HTML structure, we've got our header here. So this is just what's showing up here at the head. So I kind of want to have a website title and some supporting text that is just going to show up right below the title. So just a title and then just some supporting text, maybe a logo or a slogan or something like that. We can add in an image, whatever we want, we can add in there at that point. And then of course the navigation. So we've kept that near the top within the header area. And that's because we want to keep that area separated out. So it actually, in fact, it is out of the header itself, because if we're keeping it within the header would get constrained. We've set a fixed height for the header. And if we had our navigation bar within there, we would be cramming that within that header spacing. So not ideal. And that's why we've actually moved it out of the header. And we just have our standard unordered list and list items. And then we've styled them using CSS to style that navigation. So we've as well. So again, it doesn't, there are very little differences, if any, between how you name the naming convention. So it's how you get used to naming it. Before, what we were doing is we'd set a div and we'd give it an ID of maybe content, give this an ID of header, give this an ID of footer. So with HTML5, we've actually set up these specific tags really to break out what this content is. So this is a 1 section, 2 sections, 3 sections. So if we had a sidebar, maybe we could rename it that aside or whatever we want to name it to. If we had a blog, we could name that as well differently, articles, and so on. And
so just to note, HTML5 is pretty recent. Let me hide this. Initial release January 22, 2008, 14 years ago. So this is pretty recent in terms of what the standard for HTML is. Like I said, older browsers do not support all the features that's been added to HTML5. And when I learned how to code, I didn't learn how to code based off of HTML5, which is kind of weird to say. But I think it was whatever was right before HTML5 was still the pretty popular standard. Like he was explaining, previously we used divs for everything rather than having section, aside, so you're going to see a lot of code bases that also over abuse divs rather than using section and all the rest of these. But nav is pretty common because nav is super useful. I think that's a good little recap on HTML structuring in reference to CSS. I think we're good to move on. Kind of want to check out the template design and the explanation of it. Let's see if there's anything useful here. If there's not really anything useful, we can definitely skip ahead. Let's see what they got for us.
So within this lesson, we're going to continue pulling together all of our code. So combining our HTML, so we've got a basic HTML structure, and now we're just applying our styling to it. So our top styling, usually we start off with body. We set what we want as our body defaults. So whatever font family, our color, our background, our width, and again, whatever we're setting our body to, just getting rid of the margins, padding, borders in case they're being added in elsewhere. So we want to just set all of those to 0. And here we've got our hyperlinks. So our default hyperlink colors, when we do add in those hyperlinks within the template, they're going to be by default this color. And when you hover over them, they're going to have a background. So here I'm just going to add in a hyperlink there, just so we can see that styling at work. And when I refresh it, we see that, and in fact, it stays underlined because we do want it to stand out as a hyperlink. And when we hover over it, it does turn blue. So we could also work a little bit better with the color schema in order to get rid of maybe these orange colors. So I'm going to actually go back into here and I'm going to remove this out from the visited color because I don't want to have a different visited color. So here I'm just going to reset it. And
I might have to contact Udemy support over this.
All of these defaults. So you've got your H1 tags if you want to have padding, or if you want to set them at a specific size, you do that. Same for paragraphs. So I've just set padding to 0. And then of course, this can be adjusted to style it a little bit better. I've left spacing for images because again, sometimes with images, you might want to place them at width 100%. So 100% of the available width, and that will save images from overlapping and going outside of our borders of our elements. So it saves us if an image is 1,000 pixels and we're trying to place it in a spot where we've only got 300, it'll go way outside of the content area. So we don't want that, and we want to resize the width. And when you resize the width, it's going to resize the dimensions as well. And then just below here, so we've got our navigation. So initially, I think that we're going to set our navigation to be 100% so that it goes right across the entire page. So refreshing that again and bringing it out to 100%. You see that it does actually now contain the whole 100% width. So we want to have that block going across. And when we shrink it down, I think we did have it within our styling going to 100%, as well as our wrapper going to 100%, because we did have some fixed widths there. So just going to leave that for now, but we do have a fixed width on our wrapper. And again, our wrapper is the one that contains all of the code. So we have fixed it to 960. And when it shrinks under 960 width, it just goes to 100%. And the reason is that if we left it at 960, then we'd have to scroll over to see the rest of the content, and it wouldn't work as well on smaller screens. So then after the, so this is all of our navigation stuff, our wrapper, and our header. And as we mentioned before, we set a fixed height for the header because we did want to reserve that spacing around the header. We could do something like padding as well, margin.
All right, this is less about general reasoning for how you would design, more so like his specific reasoning for designing his page, how he designed it. I don't really think that's necessarily helpful in the realm of development. UI designers and UX designers will really handle how things should look. Your role, I mean, you could do that as well, freelance developer, but honestly, your role is mostly going to be making somebody else what they want and making sure it looks how they want. So those are things you will most likely learn from simply Googling how to make something look like how it should look. I think we're ready to move on. All right, we're not going to touch section 7 now. We're going to touch JavaScript first, and then we're going to go back to section 7 because this is more so, again, this is what I was really thinking this was going to be. This is talking about design patterns, why things should be certain ways, what tools to use, understanding and website building as tools and structures rather than understanding it as this kind of like abstract idea, because website building and website tools interact in very specific ways. One example of that, to like really explain what I'm saying, because I'm really speaking abstract, is that right now, Chrome, our browsers are one of the most significant energy users. Why is Google Chrome one of my significant energy user? Browsers handle a lot of shit on it right now. They are built with very heavy websites, and those heavy websites are all heavy because of the tooling, all this different tooling added to these websites we're making. So when we add all these different tools, building packages on packages on packages, now we have these super heavy browsers that going on Facebook or Twitter is like running RuneScape back in 2006. Like the amount of resources it requires for the computer to use to just load up a page is getting kind of ridiculous. So understanding why it's getting ridiculous, or understanding search engine optimization, aka SEO, those are going to be some of the things we cover after we learn about JavaScript, because that's more about the ecosystem of websites and how these tools are now interacting to create low-key a mess and how we're trying to fix the mess we made with website design. But I'd rather us get into coding first. And once we're able to code a website in its totality on front end, then we'll get into the ecosystem. Before I hop in, any questions with these previous CSS reviews? I know we spent probably more time than we planned on CSS. This is like the third class. I was planning on making it one class. But yeah, just want to open the floor for any questions real quick. Let me see if there's any chat questions either. Okay. All right, y'all excited for JavaScript, also known as the Wild Wild West of coding. Why is it the Wild Wild West of coding? Because JavaScript enables you to do anything. It is a land where if you can create a solution and that solution works, then boom, you can do it. And that leads back into the problem that I was talking about on websites creating a mess in terms of resource management, because JavaScript has enabled a lot of bad coding as well as a lot of, good coding. And in the attempt to seek a solution to that, we have now gone towards trying to create best practices for JavaScript, so that way we can stop making insane code. But for now, we're going to get to enjoy the insanity of JavaScript, the freedom of JavaScript. There are no wrong answers in JavaScript, as long as we're talking about like our local design and like getting to a solution. But there are most definitely wrong answers when it comes to the larger ecosystem. But for now, let's play around and see what our brains can figure out for ourselves with JavaScript. So let's get his introduction.
JavaScript is a scripting language that enables web developers, designers to build more interactive and dynamic web pages. So here's an example of some JavaScript. We've got some text in here. When you hover over, the scrolling stops. When you move off, the scrolling continues. And JavaScript is everywhere, almost everywhere. As well as introducing you all the fundamental concepts of JavaScript. Now, it's advised that you do follow along with coding. There are some online editors where you can work with them in real time, such as CodePen. And there's a list that we're going to be using. We're going to be using Aptana, saying ID is dynamic. What we've done to start out is we've created a basic HTML page, HTML5 page. And within this page, we're going to be adding JavaScript. Now, in order to add JavaScript, all you have to do is do an opening script tag and a closing script tag, and that will allow JavaScript between those script tags. So I'm just going to do a basic alert. Just going to do hello world, save that, and go back out to our page, demonstration page, and we see that the JavaScript runs, it functions, and it creates this alert that says hello world, and once we click it, then we can continue onto the page. So this is an example of some basic JavaScript. I could also do the JavaScript here. So because this is a script, a JS file, so it's related to the HTML, so all I'd have to do is do alert, and then the same thing, hello world. And once this runs, and the good thing about using CodePen is that we can see it in real time, it runs in real time, and we can see what the JavaScript is doing. There's also other options as well to run JavaScript. So here we're using Chrome. So we're able to go into the developer console of Chrome, and within here, we're able to actually type JavaScript. So I'm gonna just do hello again. And
let's also do that on our own Chrome browsers. I do think playing with the developer tools, so 3 dots, more tools, developer tools, that's also command, what is that? Command, option, and I want to try that. Command, option, I. Yeah, on Mac. Not really sure what it is on PC, but there's a shortcut. But playing with these developer tools is super important for learning and debugging in actual practice. Cool.
And we're going to pop up that same hello alert. So there it is again, hello again. So there's a number of different ways to access JavaScript. All you need to have is a web browser. And if you're using CodePen, you do need an internet connection. If you're developing your code locally on your local machine, so that means that it's not a web machine, all you have to do is run the code, run that file within the browser. So for my setup as well, I'm running a local host. So this is a virtual machine that's running in the background. So again, it's not necessary because JavaScript gets rendered out by the browser itself. So all you really need to do is have a browser and a way to type in code, and you're ready to go to follow along with JavaScript and to start beginning to write JavaScript and see what the JavaScript does when it interacts with the web browser and gets rendered out.
All right. That pretty good introduction. Don't really think we need to cover anything more there. One thing I do want to say is that, so understanding the different responsibilities between JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, super important. JavaScript holds the functionality, is the behavior. HTML is the actual structure, the skeleton, the bones of the page. CSS is the skin, the makeup, the design, the prettification of it. And then JavaScript is going to be the muscle. It's going to be the joints, the ligament. It's going to be our ability to move and interact with the page. Also, yeah, actually, no, I think that covers pretty good explanation.
So in this lesson, we're going to be going over some more basics of JavaScript. So one of the questions that often comes up is, where do I put my JavaScript? Sometimes you might see JavaScript in the head, sometimes you might see it in the body, and you might see it elsewhere in between as well. So you might see it sometimes when you go into a website and you might see something like this, where it's got document write, hello, this is JavaScript. And what this is going to do is this is going to render out this JavaScript code in this location. So when we do document write, it actually renders it out onto the page. And when we refresh it, we get that hello world, and then we get that rendered out. So there's a number of different places to place your JavaScript, but usually the best practice is to keep your JavaScript at the bottom and link out to your JavaScript file. So create a brand new file. So I've created a brand new file. I've just called it JavaScript.js. And here you can see my file structure. So I've got my index.html and I've got my JavaScript.js file. And I'm just going to do another alert here. So when the page loads, it's actually going to load the JavaScript from the JavaScript.js file. And the way to link that is to do a script source and make sure that you get the right URL for the source. So here I can just simply link to it. If the path is within your file structure, you got to make sure that you do get the right path to the JavaScript file. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete out the rest of this JavaScript. And there's basically several reasons to use an external file over these internal files. So when you're developing a website, you're going to more than likely have more than one page. So you're going to have more than just the index.html. You're going to have multiple pages. And when you link out to a JavaScript file, this is going to save you the trouble of rewriting all of that JavaScript over and over and over again on every single page. All you have to do is link out to that file. And now even if I create another page, if I call it index2, so I'm just going to quickly create another page. I'm going to do save as, and I'm going to save this one as index2. So now I've got index2, and we can see that both index and index2, they're going to be the same page. They're just going to be linked to, so I'm just going to type in JavaScript so that we can actually see something within the page. So we're going to call this JavaScript2, and maybe it should have been the other way around, but JavaScript1, JavaScript2, and now go back out to our browser. So we're going to refresh that, and we're going to see that we do have. So,
all right, so let's try that real quick. Kind of want to put this side by side. All right, so we have our big old HTML file here. I did not move the style sheet out. And we're going to make this even more cluttered by adding a script tag. And this script tag right here allows us to write some JavaScript code in. I forgot what they put in here.
And now go back out to our browser. So we're going to refresh that, and we're going to see that we do have an external file over these internal hello world, and then URL for the source. So here I can just simply link to it. If the path.
All right. Document. So this document is essentially accessing the entire page, the entire document. Then it's going to write something inside of it. Hello, this is JavaScript. We're going to see this pattern more so used to access something called the DOM. I'll show y'all what the DOM is in a second. Let's see here. Let's run. Hello, this is JavaScript. Cool, cool, cool. Page still looking chaotic and good as hell. All right. Real quick, let's look up the definition of the DOM. The HTML DOM model is constructed as a tree of objects. Here's our whole document, the root element, HTML at the top. Then we got the head, as you already know, our head, and then our body. So this thing is all called the DOM. I forgot what exactly document object model. So this whole thing is called the DOM. JavaScript accesses the DOM to then add stuff to your website. All right, super simple explanation. Any questions? If not, let's see about other ways to implement JavaScript to a page.
Is within your file structure, you got to make sure that you do get the right path to the JavaScript file. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete out the rest of this JavaScript. And there's basically several reasons to use an external file over these internal files. So when you're developing a website, you're going to more than likely have more than one page. So you're going to have more than just the index.html. You're going to have multiple pages. And when you link out to a JavaScript file, this is going to save you the trouble of rewriting all of that JavaScript over and over and over again on every single page. All you have to do is link out to that file. And now even if I create another page, if I call it index2, so I'm just going to quickly create another page. I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to save this one as index2. So now I've got index2, and we can see that both index and index2, they're going to be the same page. They're just going to be linked to, so I'm just going to type in JavaScript so that we can actually see something within the page. So we're going to call this JavaScript2, and maybe it should have been the other way around, but JavaScript 1, JavaScript 2, and now go back out to our browser. So we're going to refresh that, and we're going to see that we do have. So right now it's linking out from that external file. And if I take that and if I copy it over, and if I do index2.html, we see that we're able to access that very same file. And the benefit, again, is now if I want to change this message across my entire website, and all I have to do is update the one JavaScript file. And now when I go out, I have it on 2 separate pages, that new message popping up here. When I refresh it again, we should see that new message that's popped up. So that's the main.
All right, so let's make an external JavaScript file real quick. Same way with CSS, all about keeping the responsibilities very, very so specific to what the thing needs to do. We're going to call touch javascript.js. Add a little JavaScript file in here. And then in here, we're going to call alert hello world. And then we're going to add a little closing tag right here to notify that this is done. JavaScript doesn't really care if you do or do not. This is one of the considered best practices. And then back in our index HTML, we are going to replace this. I forget how to do this. Is this source? Ooh. Let me see if that worked. Cool. Pretty sure there's other ways to do this as well. Hold on real quick. Sorry, somebody is ringing my doorbell. I gotta go answer that. Shall I let it play? I'm gonna take that as a no. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back.
Benefit of doing it that way, and it just really does save you a lot of time, as well as whenever you're developing websites and web content, the best thing to do is always to separate out the logic. Even when it comes to CSS, you should have a separate CSS page linking out to your CSS files in order to keep everything separate. And when you come back to your website, you'll look at it maybe 6 months down the line, you can very easily say, okay, well, I don't have to go through all of this HTML code and try to pick out what JavaScript is and what I'm doing with it. I just have to go to that one main file, and from there I can access the JavaScript. Also, on a side note as well, when you are coming back to your files, a good idea is always to comment out what you want to do. So this is a comment, and it's actually not going to show up within the JavaScript. So if I've got an inline comment, and if I wanted to just write, this is for a demo, can be removed, This is where I can add in notes on what my JavaScript is doing. And again, this is really good when you're referencing things down the line and you come back to this 6 months later and you're wondering why you have alert, new message. Well, I've got a comment here that tells me what's happening. And if you have a whole bunch of commenting information, you can open and close a comment in this fashion. And so anything here will not be rendered out. So this is the same thing as what we're doing here with the commenting. And as you can see, the app Tana Studio is actually, it's being able to recognize that it's open.
Sheesh. What is going on, Udemy? I promise this week I'm gonna contact customer support because this is ridiculous. Let me check page. Well, don't tell me everything's working fine and nothing's working. It might be the video though. Let's hop on to the next video. I will say, so the scripting tag is super popular, but as we move towards frameworks being, it's like there's the coding language itself, and then frameworks are built on top of the coding language. They take the coding language and then add a whole bunch of made up rules by a user, and then a whole bunch of built-in solutions. So for example, let's go look at this real quick. If I had a solution called create alert, and we're gonna say this is a function. So let's actually make this a function. And the whole job of this function is literally to create that alert that we have, hello world. And matter of fact, we can even make this way more reusable by sending in an argument. And we're going to call this argument text. The name is very arbitrary. It could be anything. It could be text. It could be custom text. But anyway, once we have this function, essentially the rule is you have to pass this function an argument for the custom text to pass, and this thing will always return an alert with whatever custom text. So people take these little building blocks and add a whole bunch of them, and it eventually turns into a framework with a whole bunch of rules that essentially, if you follow, you get a whole bunch of built-in tooling. So when it comes to frameworks, specifically a framework like React, which we'll be working with in the future soon, the only thing we're going to need JavaScript for is accessing the DOM. But yeah, the main focus of JavaScript is going to be learning how to manipulate the DOM. Once we learn how to manipulate the DOM, then we can build on that. And I believe we're going to start looking at it with this video.
One of the really neat things about JavaScript is its ability to interact with HTML. So as we had looked at before, you can actually write JavaScript in the JavaScript file, but you can also write it within the HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a simple HTML button. And I'm going to give it a value of click me. I'm just close this off. So this creates a simple button, and right now when we click it, nothing really happens. And with JavaScript, this is where we get that dynamic interaction from JavaScript that really engages with the user and has something happen when the user takes an action. And this is really what JavaScript is all about, that interaction with the user, giving the user the ability to affect what's happening within the website and the web application. So all you have to do is add in a function. And we're just going to simply do an alert from what we did before. And remember to close those off. So now when we click it, we actually have something happening. We get this on click, this JavaScript. So this is the actual JavaScript in here. If you had some additional JavaScript, you could write that. You could call to a function and so on.
All right, so that is actually super important, pointing out the on-click feature and how you can pass in JavaScript to it. So this is one way to do it, but there are much cleaner ways. But let's actually play with that real quick. We do have our own inputs here. Let's add another input. This is just going to be a button. Button with JavaScript. And we're going to manipulate this button with different ways to get my little shortcut in. Different ways to apply that on-click feature. On-click, we're going to have this say alert. Hello. Some of the cool things about VS Code and using code editors is that they will literally highlight your letters if you have those extensions in, like JavaScript extensions and whatnot. But also, I'm pretty sure it comes built in with VS Code today. And this will allow us to visually see that this thing is a function, JavaScript function being passed along. All right, cool. I need to move my thing over here. So I have this empty button, runs the function, cool.
So if you did have a particular function, which also we're going to look at later on. So a function essentially is just this. So the alert is a built-in function, and we're going to actually look at that later on. So if you did have a function, you could actually call to that function using the on-click as well. So this gives that connection between HTML and JavaScript and gives the user the interaction using JavaScript. And there's a whole bunch of other ones that you can do as well. So when we look at, so I'm going to just copy and paste this quickly over into our HTML page. And I'm going to add this button here and just go out and refresh it. And when we talk about the DOM on a web page, the DOM is what runs, it loads in the background. So it's the document object model. And when we look at the DOM gives us the ability to see a lot of information that's available. So here I'm looking at, so again,
what is going on? This is super unfortunate. This is not what you want to see.
JavaScript is a scripting language that enables web developers.
It's just randomly deciding which video is not going to work.
Developers, designers, if you're developing your code, start beginning to write JavaScript and see what the JavaScript does when it interacts with the web browser.
Sheesh, this video really just not going to work. All right.
Because you do have this developer tool that's free to use and available within Chrome. And it also, if you're developing websites and you want to maybe you're out somewhere and you want to quickly look at your code, check something out if something isn't working properly, then again, it's a great resource to have to be able to quickly check something. So right here, what I've done is I've just simply right-clicked this inspect element, and I can see that this is that input type button, on click alert, hello, click me. So when I go into the DOM, I can see that I have all of these options here. And down here, this gives you a full listing of all the different built-in methods or built-in functions that you can have. So you do have this built-in on click. And now that I've added this on my event, I can see it actually in the DOM. So it registers the DOM, and basically it tells it that the name is on click, and this is what it's doing. So it's running this JavaScript in here. So there's quite a lot of other options. As you can see, there's a lot of them. Some of them are more related to just fields, but this really does give you a great idea of how powerful the DOM is and really what you can do with JavaScript. So basically, if you can think it, you should be able to accomplish that with JavaScript. And again, this is within the DOM. So the DOM is loading in the background and giving you that access and interaction to all these values. And we get to see an overview of what's happening within the DOM. We're going to be getting into the DOM in the later lessons as well. But for now, this was just showing you how we connect HTML with JavaScript. And we can simply just do these on clicks. And we've got some other options as well. So all you have to do is select the function that you want to run, what the event listener. So this can also be attached as event listener. So essentially that's
Wait a minute, am I not in Zoom? Oh, I thought I was out. Y'all are too quiet. I thought I was out the class. Oh man, y'all gotta talk to me every now and then.
What class?
Man, I thought Zoom crashed for a second. All right. So I should cover up the basic introductions of JavaScript. There's some pretty cool tooling. I was not aware of how much the developer tools can do for you. I usually use it for styling. Any questions before we continue on looking at what's next? Built-in declaring variables. All right, some super simple variables. Can't type fast. Cool, no problem. Any questions on the introduction to JavaScript before we start hopping into the code? Any questions about the DOM, the document object model, what you're seeing on the page right now, all these methods built in that we can access?
Is the grouping of methods together the DOM, or is the DOM like something else?
The DOM is the HTML. So this is what the DOM tree looks like. As you see, it's the entire document. It what makes up the entire document. So we have the root element, which is our HTML. And then underneath our root element is the head and then the body. And then underneath head and body, things like your title, things like elements, divs, H1s, etc., etc. Within the object model, JavaScript gets all the power it needs to create dynamic HTML. What do we mean by dynamic HTML? Exactly what you're seeing here, where these are dynamic values. Why is this a dynamic value? This will change every time I call it with a different result. Hello or goodbye. So this type of implementation of JavaScript will allow us to be able to pass in variables, which is what we're going to touch on next. And when we pass in these variables as arguments, the page will then be able to respond to whatever thing we needed to do differently based off of what input is being received. This will allow us to manipulate these elements, the body elements, the elements in the body, the elements in the title, any element that exists a part of our document. So does that make
Makes more sense? Yeah.
Any other questions about DOM, JavaScript, what JavaScript is doing? JavaScript being the behavior, the manipulation of the DOM, the HTML being the structure, the skeleton, and JavaScript being the behavior. Are we kind of visualizing how these things are interacting? Let me hear a yes in the chat if you're afraid to speak.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, so let's look at, let's see, we got 50 minutes, plenty of time. All right, so let's really dive into what some of these things are. Same how when we were in the HTML document, we added a whole bunch of tags and added a whole bunch of comments to explain concepts we're touching. Let's do the same here. I'm actually going to move variables up because variables are, I will say, a simpler structure than functions are, and they start on building functions. I also add arguments. Arguments and variables are a little bit different. So let's start defining what these things mean, seeing how they're used.
One of the fundamental concepts of programming is to use variables. Variables are a way of storing information and attaching it to a value. So I can use A and I can give it a value of hello world. Now there's different types of variables. I can do variable B and I can give it an integer value. So I can give it a value of 10, something like that. And I can also do what's called a Boolean. So Boolean is either true or false. So it's a positive or negative switch. And these are more commonly used for conditional statements where you just want to know if something is true or false. And it's important to understand the concepts of a Boolean. So it can only hold two different values. It can only be true or false, a 1 or a 0 value. And that's where we're going to look at conditions later on with Booleans. So for now, I'm just going to put true. So C is true. And there's actually different ways to declare variables. In JavaScript, you always need to declare a variable. So if I try to use something like first name, and actually I'm going to do document write. So this is actually going to write out that value on the screen. And I'm going to just do first name. So the difference here when I'm doing a document write, and if we go to the inspect element, we should see that there's an error here, that it's actually not accepting that because it's actually undefined.
All right, before we skip over to what he's talking about here, let's talk about what's going on in the first three lines here. var A, var B, and var C. So variables are themselves, just think of them best as containers. And you can literally put anything in this container. Another way to think about them is as a thing. Variables are the thing of coding. And what do I mean by thing? I mean, like, thing can be anything. Your mom tell you go pick up the thing. It could be the remote. It could go be groceries. It could be the mail outside. It's anything that you want it to be based off of the context of what it needs to be. So what do I mean by that? The first example is a string right here. We know it's a string because we can see the data structure. Anything wrapped in quotation marks is a string, which is a text value. The next one is a number. This is an integer. I wish this thing would show me in a better way, but the last one is a Boolean, which only evaluates to true or false. So I don't want that. Boolean, and these are all, I think this is called data objects, number and string, number, Boolean, basic data types. So here are some real basic data types. This is not exactly what I'm looking for. There we go. This is more so what I'm looking for. Who's a number, string, Boolean. So let's look at some real basic data types, because it's good to know what the basic data types are, because these are what we're going to be using. I chose to go to the most complicated one. So primitive values, all types except objects define immutable values, that is values which can't be changed. For example, strings are immutable. We refer to values of these types as primitive values. All right, let's look at some primitive values. Boolean types represent a logical entity, can have two values, true or false, super simple. Dialectics, positive or negative. Null type, the null type has exactly one value, null, which means absolutely nothing. The undefined, a variable that has not been assigned a value, has a value of undefined. This is what a lot of things are going to be by default. We usually do not want undefined. Undefined means that you forgot to set the value in your code somewhere. It's better to set the value to null, which shows that it was intentional, rather than let the value be undefined, which means, oh, I did not handle the use case of assigning this value, or when this value does not get assigned. Numeric types are numbers and big ints, along with NaN, which means not a number, NaN, not a number. Explaining the numeric types, number, that's going to be the 10, Number type has only one integer with multiple representatives. So one integer, 42, 0, no decimal places on the number type, if I'm remembering correctly. Is in the double precision floating point number range. I don't know what that's talking about. Big int is a numeric primitive in JavaScript that can represent integers with arbitrary precision. Big ints, you can safely store and operate on large integers, even beyond the safe integer limit for numbers. Okay, so sounds like handling complicated numbers, or maybe not even complicated numbers, just large numbers. But also, this does look like a complicated number. Not super important if you understand big int or not, because I promise you, I haven't really worked with that. Not a number, very simply, when you fucked up, you messed up your number shit. Number manipulation is also super important. Parse int. This is what you want to wrap around anything that is a variable that could or could not be a number, to make sure that thing is always a number. So that way you don't get not a number, which is honestly more so an error. Not a number and undefined are things you want to avoid generally. String type, we already know about string types. Symbol is a unique and immutable primitive value and may be used as the key of an object. Symbols are also called atoms in other programming languages. What do they mean by key? Key value. So you know something is a symbol when you see the colon and then the value, not the value, and then the key. Though I do think symbols in JavaScript are created in different ways. So this is how symbols in JavaScript is made. Other coding languages, it might look like key. But yeah, we won't go too deep into that, but understand that there is a structure called symbols that can also be stored in our variables. Variables can also contain complex data structures like objects, which is what I was showing you here, with many key value pairs. Objects can also contain functions. Though I do think I'm making, oh, I can't call it a function. FN. Shorthand for function. Which will then can also be called like this. So as you can see, variables can contain literally anything in it. It is a thing, and that thing loves being utilized to create other things. All right, so let's look at other ways to declare variables. This is not the preferred way. We're going to look at two better ways, which is going to be let and const.
So this is the reason why we have to define variables. So instead of first name, and again, when I'm doing document write, so now when I write out A, I should write out hello world, because it's so these errors are we're not looking at these anymore, and we're just able to write out variables that have been defined. So always make sure you define your variables, and common practice is to set up these variables initially and set up all the variables that you're going to be using at the top. And this is also for readability. So if you've got a bunch of values over here that you're using throughout your code, the best practice is always to declare them at the top. Sometimes the case might be that you might want to declare a variable or a value that's used within a function. So then you would be declaring a variable, and you'd give a variable a name and declare it within a function. So we're going to look at that in the upcoming lectures as well. You can also declare multiple variables, and they don't necessarily need to have a value. So these are just going to be blank, empty variables. So even if I write this, I'm actually not going to get an error message because these are declared variables, and this is how I declare multiple variables. I can also assign multiple values to these, so I don't have a defined value, so I'm just going to do it as D, and then I'm going to do this one as E. So now I see that it does write these out. So to declare multiple variables, you can start out with the var equals or the variable name that you want to use, and the variable names can be anything that you want. There are a few rules. You can't start them with numbers, so you can't do something like 1D. So right away we get that that error message there. So always make sure that the variables are being declared as a character, and then you could list other letters or numbers. So we can do D1, which is acceptable. So D1 is actually going to be different than uppercase D, so they are case sensitive as well. So when you're working with variables, you got to be aware that they are case sensitive. So if you have something that's really long and you type it hello world, so it's not necessarily going to be the same as hello world with a lowercase. And usually it's not good practice to be interchanging, to be calling them the same thing. And we do use what's called the camel case. So we start out with a lowercase first, and then if we have a second word, we uppercase that. And this gives us, it makes it more readable. So readability is one of the factors why we do these kind of camel case. But either way will work. And as long as you're not putting a number in front of the name of the variable. The rules, you can't space it out because that's not going to work either. You can't have punctuation. You can't have any characters that aren't letters or digits, but you can underscore. So if you want to underscore, you are able to underscore, and just make sure that it's not a digit first, and remember that they are case sensitive.
All right, cool. So he touched on a lot of good stuff, but he didn't touch on the really cool stuff, which is what I want to talk about. Let and cons. So var is considered bad practice. You are not supposed to use var. Why? var is way too loose. Var can be mutated, which means it can be changed. So for example, as you see, we already declared what var is right here. We declared it to be create alert. We can also override it and say, all right, now I want you to be B. And let me show y'all what that looks like. Console.log. Actually, let's see here. And then we're going to overwrite the value, and we're going to see if this thing gets called twice. So this should only get called once. Let's get out our handy dandy developer tools, go in the console. Val is not defined. Where did I say val? Oh. All right, so it only gets called once, right? Now watch this. Fn equals what is it? Create alert. All right, refresh this again. Fn is not a function. What do you mean Fn is not a function? Oh, Fn equals create alert, and then evoke it. Fn hello. Let's see if that works. What do you mean Fn is not a function? All right, so I keep trying to override it. Oh, I'm an idiot. That is correct. That is what we want to see. So at line 13 is complaining because Fn already was invoked. Fn was called console log. If I want to do this correctly, I got to do at line Fn. This is a function times 2. This is a function times 2. Now we see the line change at 17. At line 17, it fails because this is not. So now we're going to call. Honestly, I could have chose a better example, but we're going to log out Fn at this point, and then we're going to, at the third point, make it a alert. So as you can see, we got an alert. We also got, this is a function that called console log, and we also got the object, not an object. We also got the integer 10, but I logged it out as an object. As you see, this is an object. And this is like shorthand notation for FN, which is what you're seeing there. So why is this bad practice? Fn is doing 3 different things here. It is 1, a function that logs out. This is a function. 2, it is also an integer at one point. And then 3, it creates an alert. 1, that's poor readability. 2, it confuses the fuck out of the code. So what is the good practice here? The good practice is being specific in your use case. if we want a variable to be mutable, if we want it to change, we use the declaration called let, and we say let, and we're going to call this mutable variable equals, and then we're gonna, honestly, you can start a variable without declaring its value. It's good practice, again, to declare its value, but this will start as undefined. And then we can say mutable variable. I'm gonna add a whole bunch of console logs as well. Once again, this is a shorthand for the key value pair. It's just saying the key is mutable and the value is going to be whatever mutable variable is. We're going to set mutable variable to all the same things we had at one point. Create alert. We're not going to actually call it this time. Then we're going to change mutable variable to B. And we're going to log out what that value is as well. All right. I don't remember calling you, but apparently you get called somewhere. You get called because no, I have no idea why I called you, but whatever, not really the point. As you can see, mutable variable points to two things. It points to a function and it points to the data value 10. Now, the other way we want to declare variables is using const. Const means that this should be immutable. It should not change. It should be a constant variable at all times. We cannot do this because this does not change. So it's not allowed to be initialized as something that's empty. It needs to be whatever it is. And whatever it is, it needs to be always. So it's going to be create alert. And then we're going to watch me try and change it. Mutable variable equals, let's call mutable variable. And that's a number. All right. So we don't have any complaints here. Right. But you see here, uncaught type error assignment to constant variables at 23. But we do get the first time where it gets called to create alert. But at line 23, it fails because we cannot assign a variable to a constant. Anything in any variable initialized as a constant. So why do we do this? Again, the reason for doing this is to be very explicit with what type of variable we are creating, rather than just creating a variable that can be either mutable or immutable. We let the user and the computer know, hey, I'm creating a variable that is specifically here to be changed, or I'm creating a variable that is specifically here to never be changed. The preference is always going to be const. The goal with code is to make it as immutable as possible. The less things change, the easier it is for the page to compile. So we have this constant ebb and flow between wanting everything to be dynamic, which means that everything can change constantly, and wanting everything to be immutable, which means these things, values, once they are assigned, they don't get changed. And that allows us to prevent side effects. What do I mean by side effects? When I have 100 pages of code with thousands of lines of code, and all these interacting elements are triggering each other and causing this to happen and causing that to happen, every now and then, something that I might have overlooked can happen. And that can cause something like a value getting overwritten. And now that overridden value is causing an NaN, like not a number. And once I get a not a number, oh, my whole page is breaking. Now I'm searching through 100 files, thousands of lines of code, trying to figure out where the hell is something in my code overriding something else in my code and making my whole thing break. That is a terrible experience trying to debug a whole bunch of lines of code, trying to figure out what small little, like something as small as this could cause a whole bunch of shit in your code to go haywire. And you're like, wow, all I did was forget one letter. So making your code readable and making sure that you limit the amount of side effects that happen while your code is constantly interacting with each other is the way we can make the safest code possible. With that said and done and showed, I want to take out this, close out this a little bit, group them up. All right. All right, so that should cover up variables. Preference is always going to be const. Let is second. Var is absolute garbage. Please do not use this ever. Be specific in what type of variable you are creating. Any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat. If not, we're going to talk about constants. Constants are a very specific type of variables. Other than creating this declaration const, we have a specific format for constant variables, which are even more so immutable than these. And it's more so for the human user when I say immutable. So let me give you an example. Max retries, all right? Max retry, that's going to be 10. And then default text, that's going to be hello world. All right, so this does not mean anything to the code. This is no different than this or any of these things. But this right here is a format specifically for you, the developer, to know that, hey, we use these all caps to declare this variable to say that this is something that is always supposed to be 10, no matter what. Please do not change this value. Reuse this value everywhere you want to use it. So for example, you might see something like this. Function create alert. What's happening here? We have a custom text parameter, aka argument, and if this thing is undefined, it will default to the default text. Let's see if that's true. Let's call create alert, and I'm gonna call it with nothing in it. Let's see what happens. We get hello world, and then we also get hello and goodbye. Why? Because I have these two create alerts and I was not paying attention. But as you see, that was perfect because when those two got called, they got called with a value, and they overwrote the default text with what the custom text that was passed in. This should be super readable to let you know, hey, all right, here's a function that creates an alert. It takes in some custom text. If you don't give it a custom text, it will always default to this constant value called hello world that we're assuming is never going to change and always going to represent this string value. When we have variables that are more dynamically changing, we would never do something like let and constant value. This defeats the entire purpose of what we're saying here, because this is obviously mutable and this should not be. So Some rules are literally just for the developers and have no effect on the computer, but these are things that you're going to see as common practices in how people develop code. Arguments are function. Argument. What do they complain about? All right. Anyway, it's complaining because I'm not using this thing. Return. Oh, this also is not named. Default. All right. So this is the basic structure of a function. We can also assign the function. Actually, no need to talk about that right now. But yeah, this is the pretty much the basic structure of a function. The argument is whatever is passed into here. We can then use whatever is passed into here inside this code block. The code block is anything within these curly brackets. We can play around with this even further and be like, I don't know, const variable. Well, let variable equal argument return variable. So as you can see, there's a really roundabout way to just show you an example of how these things are practiced. So here I declared a variable inside of this function. This variable only exists inside of the default FN. If I try to call variable outside of it, I should get an error. Let's see, log variable. And then we're gonna copy this. And then we're gonna call default function. And we're gonna pass in an argument that says, actually, no, we're just gonna pass in max retries because I'm lazy and it makes sense to use the thing we made. All right. Variable is not defined. Thank you for doing exactly what I want you to do. So line 32, 15 should be pointing to like the line spacing or something like that. Like the actual index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 15 eventually should point to here. But anyway, really you just need to know line 32. This is breaking because variable only exists inside of this scope. Let's take this out and call default function. And then you see variable starts as undefined, then it gets set to 10. Starts as undefined where it got set and then got set to 10. And then at the end of the day, we returned a variable. How do I know we returned a variable? I can log out. I can log out this invocation, right? I can be like const return value equals default function. And then log out what the function returned. And we see return value is 10, variable is 10, and it starts out undefined. So you can literally watch the whole entire coding process as we wrote it out. Later, Nolan, thank you for showing up. But yeah, as you can see, this is how arguments are used. Please forgive me if this is kind of hard to read, but hopefully that made sense. Any questions real quick before I move on from these topics that we just touched? Variables, constants, arguments, and functions. Let me know. Any questions about these topics? Do we understand the difference between arguments, variables, constants, and functions?
Yes.
Thank you, Arnelia. Any questions? Yes, no, quick. We don't got too much time left. All right, well, no questions. I can't respond to nothing else. All right, let's move on and start looking at working with functions. And we're going to use our last 15 minutes to discuss working with functions.
In this lesson, we're going to be talking about JavaScript functions and what you can do with JavaScript functions. So functions are a self-contained piece of code. And the good thing about functions is actually they're going to be reusable. So you could use them over and over and over again, and simply by calling out to the function. So what we're going to do is simply create a function. And the way you create a function, so you just type function and give it a name. So I'm just going to call it my function. And here we have the ability to actually pass values to the function. So I'm just going to put an A there for now. Most of the time, you might not see anything within there. So this is just a way to pass values through. And we're actually not going to be using this initially. So functions are a piece of code that runs here. So we could do something like console log, and we're going to use that console log again, and hello. And this is all of that our function is going to do. Maybe we can also have a increment there. So every time we call out to that function, it's going to write out to the console and it's going to do hello. And I'm going to do a plus A. So every time we call my function, so instead of what we had before where we kept calling out to the console log, I can simply do my function. And I'm going to actually add that a bunch of times here within the code. And go back out, refresh the browser, open up our console, and we see that we're actually calling it out a bunch of times. Something went wrong there. Because we had called A here. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at as well. So the reason that didn't work is because it was expecting a value and is assigning a value to A, and then we were incrementing A. So we would have to have, we could pass through a number here, and it would actually increment A. So show you how that works next. We're just going to refresh that. So get that working first. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, to illustrate what's happening here with the code, the browser's rendering out the JavaScript. It hits variable.
I was going to pause it anyway. All right. So did y'all notice how he fucked up there? This is interactive. So I need y'all to speak up. Did y'all notice where he fucked up?
He's using var.
Not necessarily. So var, not using var is more so for us as developers, not so for the code. The code doesn't really care between var, const, and let. That's the better practice for us. So that way we can read it and be like, oh, if I see a let, I know this variable is supposed to be changed. And if I see a const, I know this variable is not supposed to be changed. That was a good answer. That was a good answer, though, because that is, it's good that you're aware of best practice, but that's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to why the code broke here, where it said not a number, not a number, not a number. Anybody else got a guess? Real quick. I'm gonna give 1-2 minutes to this. One more guess, please. Doesn't have to be right. All right, y'all too quiet for me. So I'm just gonna tell y'all. So what he did was he mixed up his variable and his argument. He changed this to a B. Why did he change this to a B? Because the variable A was declared and he had A here. So then A was expecting to be whatever is passed in. In these calls, he's not passing in anything. So these are always going to be empty. But A has been already declared outside of the function on the highest scope. And then within the scope of the function, A is being called with this plus plus sign. The plus plus sign means to, what is it called? Forgot what the name is. I gotta Google what this thing is called.
Increment. Increment.
All right, thank you. Whoever said increment, you are correct. But yeah, the plus plus means to increment. There's also decrement, whatever. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Fuck the English language anyway. But the negative means to go down. And every time this thing will call, is going to mutate this variable and increase the number by 1. So every time this function got called, it mutated this. So based off of that, if we were correcting this var, what should we make it? Should we declare it as a let or should we declare it as a const? Should we declare it as a let or a const? Come on, y'all. Hello. I'm gonna need an answer. I need y'all to speak up.
I'm gonna say a const.
All right. Why a const?
To just make sure that it's declared directly as a 0 and not being changed.
So what is the increment doing?
You said it was increasing.
Exactly. If it's increasing, the value is changing, correct?
Yeah, so okay, so it had to be a let.
Perfect. So I need y'all to speak up. The reason why I need y'all to speak up is it's better to be loud and wrong, because when you're loud and wrong, you can check your logic. And when you check your logic, then you can really understand the reasoning behind whatever I'm saying. Knowing these things in theory is useful, but like, unless you're able to apply it logically to practice, it's really useless. So we got to really check our logic and make sure we're understanding the logic, the decision-making, the thought process, and not just memorizing the rules, quote unquote rules. So the reason why this thing broke was because he's invoking these things without a argument. All of these from line 11, 12, 13, and 14, not one of these take an argument. So B is actually undefined here. But before he had it as A. A is
within the browser A. So we would have to have.
So A is declared outside here, but when you do something like this, this is going to overwrite the A here, and it's going to assume that A is the value inside of is going to assume A is the value of the argument over the value of line 10. So arguments take precedence. This is going to take a precedence over this. So if I call this max retries and did this, this thing is going to ignore this and is going to take precedence in the argument and assume that this is the argument rather than treat it like the variable. And since he passed no value to these things, B was undefined, A was incrementing. Well, technically A was incrementing from undefined, which is not a number. So it just kept being not a number. When he changed it to B now, it stopped confusing, the code stopped confusing the two, and we no longer had the side effect where we're unintentionally getting not a number. So this was a perfect example of how side effects can happen in your code if you're not being careful about how you're naming these things. That's why we have this convention. So that way there is no way I'm ever going to confuse my A here and my argument there. Makes sense? Any questions? No questions, that's also fine, but let me know if y'all have any questions. As you can see, now he's declaring them with variables. So once he invokes it with a variable, it would overwrite the B. But right now, the B doesn't do anything, so it made no sense to even do that. All right, we have 5 more minutes.
That this is a declared function. And this is, again, going back to the previous lesson, why we have to actually declare variables and values, because JavaScript has to know that A is a variable because of the way that it's declared. It's running functions. All we have to do is type in that function name, and this is being able to pass through into the function. So we can reuse it over and over again, and we can also use it here within the JavaScript. So we can do my function, and here we can also pass over that object if we wanted to. So just leaving it like that is optional. So now every time we click this button, we should see that hello, that function is being called and it's being reused. So functions are great for reusable code. And as well, you can call them at any time. So over here is
so I want to see, oh man, real quick, before we end this class.
Over this, so just leave, it's declared, it's running functions. All we have to do is type in that function name, and this is being able to pass through into the function. So we can reuse it over and over again, and we can also use it here within the JavaScript. So we can do my function, and here we can also pass over that object if we wanted to.
So we're gonna do that. This is kind of like the the checkpoint of the class. What do we call it? We have a create alert. All right, let's see if that works. Cool. So this is, all of that was to show you that. How to pass in your defined function to your HTML. All we did was we built on all the previous context. We have our default variable. We have an argument that we can pass in. We have the function create alert. It returns all of that. And then we pass that function. Well, first we access the JavaScript with a script tag in our head document. Man, this is cluttered. I can't wait to get rid of this style sheet. I'm gonna make this better. But we added the JavaScript. Now we have access to the JavaScript. Once we have access to the JavaScript, we then manipulate the DOM by adding on the function that we wrote to the on-click built-in method on input elements. I know I just said a lot of words, but that summarizes everything we did today. Any questions on all of that? Do we feel like we have a good grasp on what it looks like to write JavaScript, access JavaScript, and then use JavaScript in our HTML.
Yeah.
Cool. As we go through, we're going to keep talking about best practices. We are going to end the class here today. How do y'all feel about JavaScript? Let me hear it. Are y'all excited for JavaScript? Is it kind of confusing? Too much words, a lot of things happening. How y'all feel? Let me hear it. Real quick vibe check.
I'll say it's a little confusing for me.
All right, I love the honesty. Excited. Love to hear it. All right, the rest of y'all, I'm assuming, don't have the ability to type and respond. We're gonna keep working on it. Making sure y'all are engaged and active and following along, not just by typing, but by literally coding is very important. Once again, for your muscle memory, please, when you're in these 2 hours, utilize it by being as involved and interactive as possible. Ask questions, make sure you understand for your sake and your sake alone, because at the end of the day, you can only go as far with this as you understand it. Feel free to join me on Wednesdays for Work from Home Wednesdays. I'll be dropping a Zoom link and the document on Wednesdays, and you can simply just click on it. I'll be literally online all day, my entire work day. So you can hop in or hop out as you feel comfortable. And yeah, thank y'all for coming through. See y'all next week.